I'm Ann Rieselbach, the Architecture League's Program and Membership Director. Welcome to the first day of lectures by winners of the 2025 Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. The 6 winners were selected through an open juried portfolio competition. Entrants who must be 10 years or less out of an undergraduate or master's program and based in North America are asked to critically frame their work using the competition theme as a prompt and a provocation. On behalf of the League, I'd like to thank the League Prize Committee, Miles Gertler, Liz Galvez, and Rashad Dorsey, all recent League Prize winners, for conceiving and explicating this year's timely competition theme plot, and for selecting additional jury members, Benaz Asadi, Mario Gooden, Zhao Yi Gu, and William O'Brien, who, along with the committee, individually evaluated all of the entries and then collectively participated in an online jury session to discuss and select 6 winners from an outstanding group of finalists. Today brings the first pair of lectures by 2 of the 6 League Prize winners. We hope that you can join us again next week and on Wednesday, June 25th, to hear presentations by the other winning firms, with all sessions introduced and moderated by members of this year's League Prize Committee. If you haven't yet had the opportunity, I also hope that you'll visit each of the winners' online installations, which launched yesterday on the Architectural League's website, part of what will be a range of collection of content available on arcleague.org, including firm profiles, as well as interviews and lecture videos. Beginning this week, you can also find the League Instagram takeovers by the winners. So please follow the League if you're not doing that already, and watch for all of these. I think one set has run and another is currently running. All of the online material was created with the valuable advice and support from League staff members Zoe Fruchter, Sydney Combs, and Sasha Portis. This year, for the first time, Eddie Opera and his team at Pentagram designed the competition graphics, from the call for entries to the just released and downloadable exhibition poster, which has an embedded QR code that brings viewers directly to the installation online. And we ask that you please, anyone watching this, print out and tell your friends to print out and post a copy of the poster every place and everywhere you can think of. The entire program, from the competition to the installation, lectures, and related materials, is made possible through the enthusiastic corporate sponsorship provided by Judlow, Tischler and Son, and Delta Millworks. This program is also supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Support is also provided by the Next Generation Fund, which supports the League's investment in early career architects and designers and provides unified support for the League Prize, Emerging Voices, and the League's student and mentorship programs by the J. Clausen Mills Fund of the Architectural League. League Prize public programs are also made possible by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, and through the support of the League's members and friends. Please visit the League's website and sign up for our weekly newsletter and to learn more, including about what we're up to, including upcoming events and an extensive collection of online resources such as videos and essays documenting past programs and special projects. League Prize Committee member Miles Gertler will briefly outline the 2025 theme and introduce today's speakers. Miles, a 2023 League Prize winner, founded Common Accounts with Igor Bragado in 2016. He holds a Bachelor's of Architecture Studies from the University of Waterloo and an MArch from Princeton University. Miles is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. His firm's work has been included in exhibitions around the world, and the practice also contributed to the 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale, the 2017 Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism, and the 2016 Istanbul Design Biennial. Following the winners' presentations, Miles would join them in conversation and forward questions from the audience, which you should please pose in the Q&A section, which he'll explain further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. And many thanks all for joining for this first of the 3 events in the 2025 League Prize Lecture Series. I'm Miles Gertler. I'm co-director of Common Accounts, as Anne said, and a member of this year's League Prize Committee. I'm in Toronto, and I'm very happy to be introducing 2 League Prize winners today, Salazarsequeromedina and 11 by 17. I want to thank Anne, Zoe, Damasi, and the entire League team for organizing a competition and a public program that is as ambitious as it is smoothly run. It's an absolute pleasure to be involved. And maybe I'll first just say that when I was a student of architecture, I would look to the League Prize to understand what experimental work was pushing the field in new directions. From its very first edition in 1981, the League Prize has produced a community of winners that I think is pretty remarkable when you look back at all of the names assembled, and also very consistent in its commitment to expanding the interests of the discipline. The League Prize is, I think, singular in how it celebrates a set of actors in the field who might otherwise be missed by awards that favor more conventional forms of practice. This is an award program that's always made room for experimentalists, for renegades, and critical practitioners, really platforming its winners at pivotal moments early on in their careers. And it's influential because of its track record for selecting awardees who make an outsized impact on the field and the contexts in which they operate. So the discipline as a whole is the better for it. With Rayshad Dorsey and Liz Galvez, I helped conceive of this year's competition theme, plot, and we worked with the wider jury and just named Banaz, Liam, Mario, and Gia to select this year's 6 awardees. We'll soon hear from Salazarsequeromedina and 11 by 17, 2 studios interested in the material dimensions of practice and who responded to the competition prompt in ways unique to their bodies of work, and yet who together really exemplify much of the conceptual range that we had in mind when considering plot as a critical driver of practice in this year's competition. So in the open call, we asked what dramas are shaping the field today? How is architecture informed by considerations of plot, as land, as drawing, or as scheme? And this felt like a timely set of questions for a moment so characterized by the influence of storytelling and narrative, claims to land in truth, and a wariness for suspicion and conspiracy in daily life and society at large. And of course, let's not forget the act of plotting, drawing, and representation, which is a through line, I think, in the kind of preoccupations of many League Prize winners. In their submission, Lara Salazar, Pablo Sequero, and Juan Medina, cleverly playing with the Spanish word for plot, trama, wrote that material through lines, informed by crisis and economy of means, are really key drivers in their work. So if the subtext to their projects built in Peru, the US, and Korea is perhaps economic scarcity, their response is shaped by an ethic of generosity over excess. They ask, how simple can we build? What can be reclaimed? And to that end, their work shares in a spirit of cunning and resourcefulness demonstrated by 11 by 17. In their submission, Mahsa Malek and Yueyan, who worked between Toronto and Denver, began with an account of the procedural, industrial, and regulatory limitations and liabilities that staged the ground for building making today. They wrote, from zoning regulations to ethical considerations, material sourcing to labor efficiencies on site, and from professional conduct to increasingly risk-averse delivery methods, architecture is shaped by a web of codifications. Theirs, too, is a practice where the work is driven by an interest in material and contextual realities, but interested equally in deviation, error, and the opportunity presented by twists to norms and standards. In both cases, the jury remarked on the polish and ambition of the work put forward by these practices and really appreciated the ground covered by each, both in speculations and materialized works. My congratulations to both studios. Just yesterday, all of this year's winners exhibitions went live. You can now see Entramados Materiales and Minuscules, the shows from today's presenters, online at the Architectural League website. So we'll hear first from Salazarsequeromedina, a design studio founded in 2020. It's run by Lara Salazar, who's assistant professor at Pratt School of Architecture, Pablo Sequero, who is a visiting critic at Syracuse University School of Architecture, and Juan Medina, who is a professor of practice at Tulane University School of Architecture. And the studio's footprint extends beyond those campuses to New York and to Madrid. We'll then see work from 11 by 17. This is a design practice led by Mahsa Malek and Yueyan. Mahsa is a lecturer at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto, and is adjunct faculty at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. Alex is assistant professor at the University of Colorado Denver's College of Architecture and Planning. I'm looking forward to both their presentations, after which we'll have discussion and an opportunity to take a few questions from the audience. You can enter your questions into the Q&A feature of the webinar during these talks. Laura, Pablo, Juan, take it away.
Thank you, Miles, for the incredibly thoughtful and meaningful introduction. So before we begin, we wanted to kind of dedicate a minute to introduce ourselves. On your screens, we're Laura Salazar and Pablo Sequero joining you from Berlin, and Juan Medina joining you from New Orleans. As Miles said, we founded Salazarsequeromedina in 2020, a collaborative design practice with work in Spain, Peru, South Korea, and the US. It's an incredible honor for us to be one of this year's recipients of the League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. And we want to also take an opportunity to thank the League and Rieselbach, Zoe Fruchter, Sydney Combs, Demasi, Darby Washington, and Sasha Portis for your help and dedication these past months preparing this year's events and the online exhibition. Also, thank you, friends and colleagues who have joined the conversation. And congrats to our colleagues in this year's League Prize cohort. We're so super grateful to be among such respected peers. And with that, we'll get started with our talk.
All right, so we're going to introduce the plot to our story with this image. This was a collage presented by Rem Koolhaas in the 2009 Sharjah Biennial. And what you see on the screen is a mirage in the desert. Perhaps an image that is unreal, kind of a collage of all of these towers and like iconic buildings. But what it attempts to capture is a critique of the time, a moment in which architecture was complicit with capital, a moment in 2009, just after the stock market crash of 2008, a kind of before and after moment in history that I think many of us can remember. And to us, it was the three of us, it was particularly an important moment because it threw into question the role of architecture within society. What is it that we as architects and designing buildings are meant to kind of consider would be the kind of impact of our work as we were entering into our studies. And while many of these projects from before the crisis were kind of emblematic of a specific scale, one that even in this project on the screen, for instance, the City of Culture designed by Peter Eisenman on the outskirts of Santiago de Compostela, a project that is so great, vast, and ambitious in its kind of territorial extent, in its programmatic kind of complexity. It was a landform building of its time, and it really captured a kind of shift in which our generation was no longer able to think of producing architecture of this scale. We had to, from the economic crisis to many crises that have followed, the health crisis of the pandemic, the current and ongoing climatic crisis, and political and social crisis that have kind of marked our recent history. We have kind of come to terms with the idea that we are we operating in the world as architects through a kind of modality of scarcity. And what is it that what is it that we can actually produce as a kind of response to that condition. And so we come back often to diagrams such as this really beautiful diagram drawn by John Houbraken, which captures this notion of architecture as a kind of frame, one that produces a support within which an infill can be embedded. It is a space that is generic as a kind of infrastructure, where this kind of specific nuance of occupation is defined by user, is defined temporally. And so this kind of back and forth between the kind of generic and the specific, the infrastructural and the infill, introducing kind of a notion of time to us has become an incredibly powerful way of working. And we love projects like this, a realized kind of exposition from Raumlabor in Berlin, where we are today. This beautiful moment underneath a city highway, a space that would never be inhabited and is probably forgotten, and is probably deemed useless. And just by inserting something so thin, paper thin as a pneumatic structure, can completely overturn the kind of meaning and use of that space, introducing community, introducing a whole other way of engaging with that kind of same urban environment. And it's so, in that sense, through our work, we've always been interested in that kind of resonance between the specific and the generic. And this installation that we produced for the Arc League Prize is in a way a reflection and a rehearsal of those ideas.
Yeah, so like Laura is saying, the commissioned installation that we developed for the League Prize is based on this kind of series of spatial prototypes or architectural models, which we called entramados materiales. This kind of stems from, as Miles was saying, an exercise of translation, which would translate more as framework. And we really like the kind of open-endedness of developing our architecture as frameworks. We use these experiments to explore how material constraints, processes of assembly, and the use of ordinary components can unpack new spatial relationships that are kind of non-hierarchical and interdependent. The work overlaps with our current kind of ongoing research on the transmutability of building function and the role of these open-ended structures as kind of vectors that could be capable perhaps of reconciling building practice with the challenges of our time that Laura was mentioning before. And we did this, if you may, through a kind of typological exploration of these kind of frameworks or open-ended structures, a canopy, a bench, a frame, as architectural devices or artifacts that are semi-permanent, open to appropriation, and through kind of multiple iterations, simple shifts within found conditions, they kind of invite interpretation or participation or different kind of processes of resignification. We developed these projects in the Pratt Institute Pfizer building just last month. And so they are very site specific and they populate 3 rooms. And like our work and what we were saying at the beginning, they kind of like to generate some sort of tension with the pre-existing frame, attempting to break through, but nonetheless within. And we think of them as maybe as a starting point through an expression of their kind of off-the-shelf, unfinished, reused components and an impromptu, very kind of radical approach to tectonics. Halfway, as we describe them, if you may, between the Bjorn Knudsson's plateaus and platforms and Noguchi's useless architecture. So kind of hinting towards a non-prescribed use. And the point is that we really like to do these model exercises as a kind of rehearsal, as something that becomes part of our repository of images that we then revisit with each project. So the next work that we'll show you quickly is a pavilion that we developed with Frank Barco for the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism, the outdoor room, where the theme was land architecture, land urbanism, and it was kind of inviting architects to think about the impact of building on land, right? So a very, very current and important and urgent topic. When we visited the site, a void between two larger voids that were part of the kind of mega structure imperial complex, we saw that this is a kind of really contested site that has had many lives. Recently, it was part of the imperial palace, then it became military barracks, which you see in the image on the left from some years ago. And then very recently, it kind of became again a park appropriated by citizens and reestablished that relationship with the mountains as the backdrop, which was always very characteristic of Seoul, as we learned. So we want to kind of really explore that idea of the wall and amplify the condition of void, but within kind of more as a void within a void, a room at a human scale that would invite citizens to kind of sit in and enjoy a public space in a scale that is familiar to everybody as a domestic scale, right? So we were obviously engaging with patio typologies that is present in, as you see here in the images on the left, in the imperial palaces, or on the right, in the hanok, in the traditional vernacular house. While we were having conversations with the curators, with the curatorial team, and with Sarah Kim, who leads Diagonal Thoughts, a practice in Seoul, she said to us, why don't you, I have this pavilion that is coming down in a couple of months, just when we are going to build your pavilion. So why don't you try and fit the material and repurpose it in your pavilion? So we were super excited with this idea, and then figured the tectonics of the pavilion through reusing, as you see in this color diagram, all the elements that we inherited for her pavilion and kind of configuring these four walls. The final element was this element of surprise, this kind of interior condition that therefore generates a kind of blurriness between interior and exterior, a garden of native plants that would be kind of the anchor of the project. And, then it proved we really enjoyed to see the pavilion being used with these kind of slip spaces, these open corners, these cutout windows that would invite people to kind of discover that surprise garden in the interior. Some images of the pavilion in the city and kind of generating new relationships with the pre-existing buildings and landscape on the site. And then we always like to finish with this image, which kind of taps into this notion of kind of reducing waste as much as we can and leaving no trace. And if there is a trace, it's maybe a kind of element of regeneration with this kind of garden of native plants in the center of the pavilion.
Yeah, so in the way that the Seoul Pavilion was a kind of register of the local patio or hanok typology, and kind of learns from local building practices, reusing materials, so does this translate kind of geographically to another project in Peru, where we were looking at the typology of the teatina, which is this kind of window, let's say a clerestory window that pops out and emerges from the horizontal plane of a colonial era roof in Lima, Peru, and really all along the Peruvian coast. And what this does, this figure emerging from the roof, it produces stack effect ventilation, or rather the kind of Bernoulli principle, where heat rises and is able to escape through this kind of vertical opening. And also, it introduces through, and it's not just a passive ventilation strategy, but it also introduces light in a really kind of beautiful, indirect way, in an atmospheric way, into these kind of deeper floor plates of Peruvian typical house. And so in this project, which is a guest house in the desert, we have abstracted the form of the teatina, but really learned and reinterpreted its kind of systematic principles, producing these kind of larger volumes that figure the section of the project, allowing hot air to rise, allowing a kind of opening for that hot air to escape, producing indirect light as well into these kind of smaller monastic rooms. And the whole project is also kind of constructed from this brick. It's called rococho regionally. Rococho translated to English just means overly burned. You might also know it as clinker brick. But we're really interested in this kind of scale of practice as well, not just learning from the kind of conditions of building culture locally, but also through its kind of material assemblies. And this brick, which is local to the specific valley where we're building this house, has 3 different categories based on how deformed and burned that material has become. And so it also kind of categorizes and codifies how much of it can be actually redeployed into like a typical construction, and much of it is discarded and considered waste. And so in our work, we're always interested in how this waste or how a kind of offcut can be redeployed in the work in an interesting way. In this case, kind of taking on the non-structural capacity of that material, but kind of using it ornamentally, and really thinking through the kind of detail of the project and how it expresses a kind of local knowledge. And then the same kind of research project that began with the Teatina has found a way to translate itself into a completely different context. This one motivated by an invitation to the Biennial for Architecture and Urbanism in Versailles, curated by Sanafrini and Philippe Ram, in which they asked, how can we learn from local construction methods and building typologies from the Global South to inform new strategies for a warmer kind of northern or western city, such as Paris, where perhaps many of the kind of 19th century building stock visible in the city was constructed in consideration of the cold weather, the necessity for chimneys that are kind of moving up vertically through the flues embedded within the party walls between buildings, and are now used as a kind of locale for antenna and all forms of kind of contemporary domestic devices, but largely kind of obsolete in their kind of original function. And so what we were thinking of the same kind of principle of this stack ventilation and how we could kind of graft an artifact onto the chimney, turn it into a solar chimney, if you will, through the same set of principles that we observed in the Teatina, but this time perhaps more technologically by proposing a kind of double chamber system where the heat that is generated in the lower chamber draws air up and out of the Parisian apartment, and the chamber on the top moves the air quickly and efficiently out into the atmosphere. And so we imagine that these devices could take on many different forms, but eventually, if they would become kind of deployed throughout the city, it would have an interesting kind of effect within the kind of topography or the roofscapes of the Paris that we know. And so the project was presented at the biennial that I mentioned at the beginning through a very large scale model at 1 to 10 that was built with the help of possible scenarios based in Paris, exemplifying, we would say, a kind of version of this kind of grafted device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll finish soon. Just one last project here. But as Laura was saying, we're really kind of enjoying working within this context that is shifting more and more towards understanding, new definitions of sustainability, both in academia and in practice, that maybe relate to this idea that, that the Paris Biennale was prompting us to think about, which is one of maybe adaptation, no, and transformation of what is already there. In order to be more resilient with ever increasing temperatures and extreme weather. So this final project, which is actually starting construction tomorrow, is another one that we're super excited about. It's a monumental splash, a temporary installation for Concentrico International Architecture Festival in Logroño in Spain. And basically what we're proposing is to transform temporarily an existing monumental fountain into a kind of public swimming pool, no? Or the edge of a public swimming pool. So this is the fountain, the Espartero fountain. And why we came up with this idea is basically because Concentrico was very kind of smartly pointing to this year's theme as kind of rethinking public space in the city through the lens of, how do we fight the urban heat island effect, which for those of you who don't know means just, that spaces that are prone or vulnerable to be, extremely vulnerable to heat because they have a lack of vegetation or a lack of water spaces. And so basically we kind of co-opted, or we went into looking at vernacular typologies again, like, temporary structures for ephemera in Spain, or, inflatable swimming pools, or these kind of mobile swimming pools in New York City in the 60s, and kind of come up with this installation that really prompts citizens to come closer to the water's edge, and generates this, again, this ambiguous platform, like the models that we were showing at the beginning that we did for our League Prize installation, and invites citizens to sit around and appropriate and bring new meaning to the installation. So one more thing, we wanted to kind of go back to the beginning of the talk and say how maybe transversally through a house, a pavilion, an installation, or models, we like to think of our architecture as one that is kind of keen to observe the ordinary, the as found, and to establish a dialogue through grafting or transforming or resignifying, maybe going back to Miles's definition at the beginning, kind of using the as found as material, no? In different ways. And in that way, generating new uses and meanings, forms of appropriation and interrelationships. And having said that, we're very excited to hear from Mahsa and Alex. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo, Laura, Juan. That was fantastic. I think, yeah, my audio is on right now. But yeah, I just want to start by saying how great this session is. There's just a lot of behind the scene work that, thanks to Anne, Zoe, everything is going so smoothly, and which is sort of much more fantastic than we initially anticipate. And for that, my name is Alex Yueyan Lee, and together with a better half of our practice, Mahsa Malek, we share a sort of architecture practice here. And I have to say we're very honored to be among this year's winners, and specifically under the theme of plot. And I think, like, as you can tell from Laura and Pablo and Juan's presentation, we are also very compelled by this year's theme around plot, precisely because it really echoes a lot of topics and themes that are currently running in our own practice, and more positioned as a question to perhaps rethinking how architecture practice could be designed, both at the local and global scales. And in many ways, which Miles mentioned early on, this notion of plot for us really refers to what we in the past understood as grand narratives, master plans, spatial hierarchies, the formal ideologies, so on and so forth. And I think for a very long time, these sort of notions have remained as a very easy target as a way to become radical within the contemporary discourse. And sort of operating within this context, our practice is perhaps more invested in sort of working with these plots, quote unquote plots, less as a radical sort of reinvention, but more towards thinking sort of, is there any workarounds or potential twists, which I think in a lot of cases are very much the subtle, the incidental, the overlooked, but perhaps in our mind can be argued to even become more consequential in the longer term. And ultimately really disrupting the trajectory of how things are supposed to run. And for that, we conceptually consider these things as minuscules. And then specifically, they really manifest through our effort to constantly articulating sort of the present condition of building making. And in thinking fundamentally about, or even in a very straightforward way, what is a building substance and how are things made and what are they specifically? This entails sort of mobilizing a type of research skill set and looking into materials histories, both critically and operatively within the production of a design scheme. But at the same time, not losing sight of the implication of even as small as a particle in geographical and territorial scales. And of course, I think this is tremendously hard to think through these issues in a both small and large way, precisely because we have been conditioned by apparatus such as ruler, which really specify a range of scale focus that has been allowed in architecture as a visual discipline. And of course, we consider ourselves a culture producer, but also people who are highly capable in a technical way. So thinking through the sort of technicality of matter, material, materiality, and how they folds into the spatial quality is something that we are fundamentally interested in. But also thinking largely about how things are handled, sort of the inevitability of involving trades necessitate a particular sequence of symboli, which we felt there's a lot of opportunity to sort of translate specific logistics into a tectonic expression as well. And lastly, ultimately, we are interested in engaging critically, not just the material itself, but also what's around the material, the context and the pretext that inform or situate the material that we are exploring. These are the things that are typically already existing in place that came before us. So I think there's a lot of question for us to even think through what does that even mean in the way we practice nowadays. Maybe just to summarize a little bit, and I think the way in which we situate and orient our practice at 11 by 17 for us is really about a continuous sort of articulation and slowly embodying those knowledge and ultimately execute those knowledge as a form of architecture agency and hopefully through the sort of exercising these new and old material knowledges itself would result into the accumulation of material or something that's more or less a building. And of course, over the year, we've been working across various different mediums, On the same kind of idea, whether that's a book, whether that's an installation, whether that's an exhibition, and or something furniture, but also at the scale of a building. And then today we're just going to show 3 projects that we worked on in the past and explaining how they sort of accumulate into our more recent thinkings that we have been commissioned for the ArcLead Prize. So the first project that we're going to talk about here today is titled Particulate Signals. And within this project, we were very interested in, from the get-go, really interested in the idea of how can we think about material at a specific, much smaller scale, and how that gets handled in making a form. And so that involves a lot of researching into reading through the early material and construction histories that came with this material. And the reading through the very dry records of scientific experiments, but also going beyond our sort of traditional disciplinary bound to look at construction menus, which are designed with the builders in mind. And I think it's also for us about studying the technologies that are currently present in the making of concrete and handling the form. So in this case, the formworks and the mechanism of them is something that we were very interested in sort of uh, to learn about at the same time. And for the project itself, we were really using plan not as a way to describe a form, but rather as a way to draw out, as a way to play out a sort of hypothetical scenario for the construction process. And then we were also working with a time-based medians, in this case, as a way to further sort of reveal a potential consequence that would come out of a particular way of thinking related to construction. And I think that the image perhaps even tells a sort of a more kind of expansive story, how can we relate form back to where it might come from? And perhaps there is a contextual reason why certain forms are made, both technically, but also given the particular constraints attached to a particular material. And especially, and I think architects tend to be visual thinkers. We are genuinely interested in the space making ultimately, and how this sort of technique in itself can produce not just a singular materiality, but perhaps multiple materialities, which then start to suggest a way of occupying this space around these objects. And the next project is slightly different in looking at the sort of construction technique of a standard the steel construction. It's called Rural Shed. It's actually going to construction this summer, which we're very excited about. And the building itself measured roughly 10 meters by 8 meters, and it's conceived of as a collection of the steel plates, which are rotated 90 degrees from each other as a way to form a very sharp and lean form. And the proportion itself follows a strict 1:3:5 ratio increments. And elevationally, as we can see from this image, the building tries to really oscillate between different kinds of extremes. On the one hand, the really big and vast kind of the sizing of the steel plate, contrasting the very tiny, skinny, sort of slender profile of the structure members. And sectionally, the design also tries to express this idea of leanness through a particular way of engineering and mainly sort of thought through within this section. Planometrically, the floor plan, the building also tries to produce porosity relating to its rural context, which are packed with greeneries and vegetations. And one thing that we were very sort of invested in is to formulate sort of collaboration model that perhaps has a tighter back and forth between the specific material constraints versus the material outcome, formal outcome that it would produce. So we brought in the structural engineer, but also fabricator from day one, even before we start designing the project, as a way to create a dialogue in thinking through how this can be produced in a different geographic location. Which ultimately sort of has a lot of tectonic consequences in the expression of leanness that we are hoping to achieve within this project.
Next, I'll present Foundation House, where the narrative was about underpinning an existing exterior brick wall. Here you can see a photo of one of our models. The project was a material reuse experiment in which we converted a single-family house into a multi-generational home. The project came with an existing building that's situated in northern part of Toronto. And prior to getting this project, the house had already gone through multiple layers of renovation. So we kind of wanted to build on that narrative and use the house as a palimpsest. And in doing so, we had two particular strategies in our alteration process. One was a vertical microspatial expansion through the technique of underpinning, where we collaborated with structural engineers and trades to create a unique underpinning sequence surrounding what used to be an exterior brick wall, and figuring out a process that unified the three different types of foundations that we found within the house during our experiments. And experientially, we're also very interested in leaving some traces of this process, which here shows up as a datum line finish throughout the living spaces. And here is a photo of the underpinning in progress, where we were able to add about 5 feet to where it used to be a crawl space. And our second strategy was using that same brick wall as a separator between the private and the more public spaces of the house. So here in the plan, you can see the thickness of the brick wall acting as a separator between the bedrooms and the bathrooms and the main living spaces. And we find this image to be like really beautiful to us because considering the different layers of change that the house had gone through, we had to be very careful with our demolition process, and our framing strategy also had to be very interactive and site-based. As you can see from the picture, you can see what was new, what was old, and all these three stages of the renovation kind of show themselves in this picture that we find really intriguing. And here we have a render of that brick wall where the old and the new interventions are intertwined and coming together. With a more recent photo of that condition at the bedroom looking towards the living area that's near completion. And so for us, this project was quite important in that it made us question our authorship as architects and to really understand what it means for inheriting a building to be our first act of design. And it transformed the way we think and the mode that we practice now. Which brings us to our next project, Minuscules, which was our installation for this prize. We want to have a special shout out to Gabriel Harada for his contributions and support in managing different trades and fabricators throughout the process. So this is the site. We loved the storefront nature of the site and how it could be activated not only at daytime, but also at night with the right set of lighting. The space used to be a pizza shop, which is now vacant, and it was kind of designed and maintained as such. There is a hope that another pizza vendor would eventually take over the lease, and considering that everything is set up, it would continue to operate as such. And so in addition to all of these movable furniture, there was an abundance of fixed pieces, such as the dropped millwork ceiling, the benches, the counters, and especially since we were asked to leave the existing space as is, we had to have minimal contact with the millwork, basically. But we really liked the up-and-coming area in Denver that the site was situated in, and the activation opportunities that the exhibition had for the larger community, especially considering that a new public park was opening right in front of it. So we decided to take on the challenge. As part of our minimal contact mandate, we developed 3 strategies for our work. So we introduced podium bases as a way to echo the existing benches through their finishes. We had structural elements that are left exposed throughout the space that act both as structure and a visual support for the white box gallery. And then by the use of mini clamps, we were able to hang this lightweight platform below the millwork to kind of act as the ceiling. So here's the plan of the space. You can see the 3 layers of spatial separation. First, there is the storefront, and then you have the serving area that's still considered front of house, and then a larger back of house kitchen. And we were really interested in extending more this separation between front of house and back of house. So the project is conceived as a white box that gets inscribed into the existing pizza shop in a fragmented way. So here you can see the image of the intervention with a series of temporary floating planes to create this white box gallery in what we call the front of house. And here you can see some snippets of the existing slipping through the planes as you start to walk down the hallway. And then once inside and towards the back, the space, the intervention is kind of acting as an apparatus where you connect with the surrounding urban context. And as part of the interventions, the visitors are encouraged to walk behind the white box gallery and interact with the back of house, where the construction traces and tectonic elements are intentionally left exposed. So here you can see the back of house elements of the wall and the relationship to the hung ceiling and how all of the layers are kind of collapsing into one. And then the other elements of our intervention, we're also framing the fixed furniture, without disrupting their future use. And so for us, this project was an exercise in using minimal contact with the existing while being able to produce a big impact. It echoes the front and back of house spatial relationship of the pizza box, but in a white box front versus the back of box construction look within the space. So we'd like to wrap up the lecture here on the note that a project, I think for us, is really about articulating our present relationship to what came before us, and that perhaps kind of articulating that relationship is in itself a design process and something that we're interested in. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you both for these amazing presentations. I'd like to start with a couple of questions, and I'll just remind the audience to enter your questions into the Q&A feature of the webinar. The first thing I want to talk about is sort of maybe a silent partner in all of your practices, as well as in my own, which is distance, a kind of remoteness, right, between studio members, the distance between your desk and your project site, and also just, distance in terms of ground covered, the kind of itinerant nature of your practices. You and your work all seem to travel as a norm, right? So, there's the schools that you're tethered to, and there's the maybe hometowns and collaborators, past and present, who kind of appear here and there in the work. But equally, I would guess that, the kind of counterpart to the practice is all of the ephemeral, invisible, and virtual stuff. But since your practices are both so invested in material stuff, I wanted to know if distance frustrates or enhances your preoccupation with those features of your work, or just generally, do you theorize distance in your practice? Have you, or is it simply a kind of feature of practice that we should take for granted today? I'll open it up to whoever wants to respond first.
Yeah, I'll respond to that, Miles. Thank you for the question. Um, for us, distance is, of course, pragmatic in a pragmatic way, many times a problem because it implies traveling a lot. Naturally, we are far from many of the sites that we're in, but at the same time, this this distance allows us in our dialogue, in our different places with our different time zones, to look at the existing, at the ordinary, uh, without, of course, all the components that we have talked about, of course, to avoid, from a sustainable approach, to avoid demolition and all this that is in our work, but at the same time, without nostalgia, without this sense of nostalgia. Material for us, or the existing for us, it's a local quarry. We like to see it as architect and therefore as materials. The materials now have different constraints. It's not the standard sizes of the bricks, the resistance of the concrete, because that is already proven in what's existing. And therefore we want to utilize it without this nostalgia. And for that, distance helps us a lot, not to fall in this idea of caring of many things. We used to have a professor in school who said never visit the site before thinking the project, because you will get in love with it or you will hate it. So uh, we have to analyze it in a pragmatic way. And of course, we need to go, we need to understand what's happening, but at the same time, the distance helps us to dialogue freely and understanding the existing as quarry.
Yeah, I guess I'll just follow on that. No, I think that's absolutely true. I think it's a very wonderful question in the sense that there are so many dimensions to the distance, almost like the question around plot. It can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I think maybe as an oversimplification, distance is usually very productive, or at least we would like for it to be productive if it doesn't lead to a specific kind of frustration. And I think it's just thinking sort of throughout the history of architecture, distance can also be easily understood as a translational issue. So maybe that's the sort of differences between drawing and building that we've been talking about for a very long time. Um, but I think maybe, Miles, what you are gesturing towards is perhaps less about the translational issue, but more that within the translational issue, naturally, you have to involve a lot of different thinking, a lot of different expertise. So it's not so much about building what you had drawn already versus sort of using sort of render as a way to testify how great the building is. So I think maybe what we're less interested in that sort of rigid model. And then the question becomes, how do you develop a sort of a fluid attitude and open to change while also being very fixated on what you're trying to achieve, or find a sort of within the final result. So I think that's very interesting question because it really brings up a lot of dimensions in the way we rethink how we can practice in a more sort of mobilized but also kind of curated way.
Well, I've also always, thought that as a young practice, there's a kind of benefit, right, to sort of spreading out. The idea that you cover more ground, you're able to encounter more opportunities to sort of materialize your work, materialize your research. So it seems there's also a kind of strategic feature there, as well as a necessary one, right? I mean, it's important to, I think in all cases you're all teaching at schools. You go where there's opportunity there as well. But it's interesting just the kind of spread. I think your two practices paired together really sort of demonstrate just the sort of extent of reach that a young practice today can typify in some cases. I wanted to also ask about both of your use of the ordinary, the as found, the off the shelf in your installations, in your exhibitions. The results, they nonetheless kind of aspire to something more than ordinary, I would say. And I think as larger projects, they're both in some ways unsatisfied with normativity, right? Despite the kind of curiosity for its tropes. There's a kind of restlessness in I think both of your work and your exhibitions, for instance, seem to want to kind of produce novelty from the familiar. So, maybe kind of also it's worth kind of thinking about the moment that we're in, where daily life and the ordinary has been a kind of central preoccupation for architects. I know that's certainly been an interest at Princeton, where Laura and Mahsa, you both did your master's degrees. And I wonder if, more broadly, you could comment on your practice's relation to the everyday and the ordinary, perhaps in contrast to like the every other day and novelty.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know. I think personally, I find boring things sort of fascinating. And this is something that, of course, started at Princeton, but continues throughout. So I think, I don't know if we like using the word ordinary, but just like, typical things that are readily accessible, let's call them, and then trying to find ways to use them in novel ways that are not uh, perhaps thought of before. Like exposing a stud, that's not something that someone wants to do, but if it ties into the conceptual framework, like why not? And that way you can also, remove it and move it as well, because that was part of the mandate for our exhibition. So I think, yeah, trying to find the full circle moment of where these ordinary things help us frame, you know, on ordinary results, and then tie into the bigger scheme of things, I think is where we see it.
Yeah, I mean the question is super interesting, and I think we could go quite deep with it. I think when we speak of the ordinary, we're talking about the Smithsons. We're very influenced in a way by their work as a reflection of the period in which they were building, and how much that kind of work centered the occupant, and kind of decentered, let's say, the kind of image or object of architecture. It really kind of elevated this notion of process, and through that kind of foregrounding of the process itself, the materials and its assemblies were also kind of exposed. I don't know if it has so much to do with the notion of a pursuit of invention for its own right, but rather a kind of perhaps more perhaps a realization that our kind of means, our wheelhouse of work is more pedestrian. It's more accessible. Our work is kind of interested in being realized, and so somehow those constraints in and of themselves kind of push us in a similar way to the Smithsons to think through the kind of availabilities and contexts that we're working in.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that something that I found beautiful is that in history, many things remain the same, many heights remain the same, many purposes remain the same, shelter, the sizes of the things, the sizes of intimacy, and that is somehow what we call ordinary as well. Those things that we see in old pictures, in old drawings, in old paintings, and we assume or we embrace that they still work like that, that they are still like that in our day-to-day lives. And some others that we don't feel anymore attached to them. And that is the gap, I think, for resignification. That is the gap for embracing the spatial condition, embracing all those things that are permanent, and adding a new way of looking at it, a new way of signifying it. And like that, I'm also going back to the idea of nostalgia, that we don't feel, or the romantic, no, that we don't feel that comfortable with as we feel with that is permanent, that is ordinary, or that is normal.
Mm. And maybe just to add to that, uh, the idea that many things that we work with, and I think that our generation works with, are already there, and we're trying to learn how to deal with things that are already within our built environment, whether they're materials or sites or buildings themselves. I think that that is also resonant in the work of 11 by 17 as a kind of exploration of a new set of methodologies. I love this idea of a kind of form of minimal contact as a way of expressing a kind of relationship that is kind of embeds a precision within the architectural project. And so we're really talking about the same things.
It's fascinating. I really appreciate your expanded sort of notion of ordinariness, and Juan reaching back to through history and trying to kind of identify familiarities, and even sort of the use of nostalgia as a tool to kind of detect these things. I think that's really fascinating. There's a kind of split maybe between like the conceptual embrace of the ordinary and the as found and the familiar, and then just like the pragmatics too of the kinds of projects that I think are available to young practices, right? Which are so often based around event, temporariness, and I mean, in some cases even spectacle, right? Like a festival. So it's this kind of interesting sort of thing between the kind of pragmatics. Sometimes it seems like actually the most difficult thing is sort of ensuring that whatever you've built persists, that it lasts, that it has a kind of lifespan beyond the kind of temporary. We have a question from an audience member. Eric asks, how does adaptive reuse tie into the scarcity mentioned by Salazar-Sequeromedina and the scale of the minuscule mentioned by 11 by 17? Can these outlooks translate to larger scale projects? And is that of interest to your practices? I'll open it up to whoever.
Okay, I can jump in. Yes, I think that the notion of scarcity relates to adaptive reuse first through the kind of mention of the climate crisis. We are, as many know, and are kind of coming to accept, we're coming to terms with a building industry that contributes to an enormous proportion of carbon emissions. And as architects that design buildings being constructed today, we are in many ways kind of complicit with those extractive practices. And so the idea that our kind of world materials are scarce, that the kind of resources available to kind of ecosystems, people are kind of diminishing, kind of really pushes us and forces us to question whether we should ever demolish buildings, whether it's good to build a new building, or if we can take advantage of the existing building stock. And, Miles, as you mentioned, many of the projects that we have access to as young practitioners are temporal in nature. And through a kind of material repurposing, we try to kind of envision second and third lives to them. But if you know, in the kind of scaling up of our practice, I think dealing with adaptive reuse through multiple different kind of methodologies of adaptation, kind of considering a way in which working with something existing is an act of design. It's not merely a renovation work, but it is kind of at the kind of level of a new architectural project. I think that is a kind of area of enormous interest to us.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a statement. No? I mean, the idea that there's no empty site, there's no tabula rasa. We start with something that is already full, and we transform it. No, and I mean, Laura mentioned before Alison and Peter Smithson, and we always like to bring up our heroes. No, and like obviously for us when we were students, and this project, the Palais de Tokyo, no, by Lacaton and Vassal, was finished, we were like, okay, wow, you know, they were really signaling the way in which practice was going to shift, you know, both out of the kind of economic and political crisis, and also of the need of kind of addressing building stock that is there, that is available, that is kind of slowly decaying over time, and where you can have kind of interventions of different scales, no? Which I think is also interesting, kind of tying to what Miles was saying before about the scale of the projects that we do, no? There's kind of different temporalities and scales within adaptive reuse projects that are really kind of thought-provoking in the way in which they generate tension and transformation with what is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I guess in our work we rarely use the word adaptive reuse. And this specific terminology was one sort of concerned about the sort of the similar thing that we saw during the sustainable period. And I think Laura, Pablo, you described so well that there's a sort of finer definition to the word itself that perhaps can open up the image itself. Because I think when we talk about adaptive reuse these days, to me, there is already common understanding that it's a juxtaposition between old and new. Somehow I do worry that that the terminology itself is going to restrict the design process to a specific formal outcome. But I do love about this idea of sort of working with existing and trying to respond. To me, that's much more profound than reproducing the sort of inheriting existing without any criticality. Yeah, so I guess it's a tricky question in a way, sort of how should we respond to that? Maybe one short answer is really depends.
And one thing that I think we are also circling about in our office would be the part of the question that has to do with the scale. Would this work at every scale? That is also a very tricky question because, of course, whenever we talk about infrastructure, say infrastructural building, and we were talking a second ago about Lacaton and Vassal, but the Nantes School of Architecture is a completely new building, but we immediately understand it as an infrastructure, and we know that that building will work and will be adapted and will be reused in so many ways. But I think we as an office also hesitate whether we should build infrastructure in order to be reused, or we also accept that many big places that are not infrastructural, that are full of useless small rooms, can also become a source of infrastructure somehow, of flexibility as void or as solid, but somehow letting the users, like we saw with Raum Labor in the presentation, appropriate from that space and consider it something that was finished, again open-ended, which is kind of something that was the last word of a sentence suddenly becomes the first one for continuing. So I think the scale becomes tricky. Of course, the bigger things are, the most difficult are to appropriate them fully, but we're seeing many examples in our imaginary by Beplus or like Pandaluga with how we can start as a society populating little by little until we don't need the we don't we're not scared anymore about the scale, no? So it has to do with time and not struggling that much with finishing, but a process, no? So
Amazing. And, maybe something that's sort of implicit to this discussion in your exhibitions, for instance, is like, the importance of tacit knowledge, the importance of being there, knowing, in some way, what's there to be reused. Like Alex Mahsa, how you found this pizza restaurant that was available for your exhibition. And Laura, Pablo, Juan, how you met this architect who had a bunch of timber available for repurposing. I mean, these things are difficult to sort of plan for, but perhaps they're the sort of chance encounters that produce real sort of ingenuity. I think this is a great place to hold the conversation. Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers and consideration of this year's theme plot. Anne, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you too for this wonderful first program, and both firms with their eye to the experiential aspects of exploration and occupation, including, the delight of discovery of the traces and evidence of structured material use. I mean, it was just terrific. I'd like to ask everybody to come back, same time, same place next week, to hear Deborah Garcia of Deborah Studio and Karina Caballero and Camila Ula Vasquez of Otros Antragabos, and Rashad Dorsey is the committee member who will introduce and conduct the conversation that we had today. But meanwhile, similar to what we had today. Meanwhile, thank you, everybody. And we're just excited to hear more. And also with each of you to talk with you more about the installations as we go forward with the interviews that will be published later this summer, and add even more along with the recordings of these presentations to the website. So thank you very much.